The stories that run the world. A reflection. Lately, I've been thinking about money. That probably sounds less exciting than it should. Most conversations about money tend to go in familiar directions. Who has enough? Who doesn't? Whether capitalism works, whether socialism works, whether taxes should be higher or lower, the usual stuff. What interested me was something much stranger. What exactly is money? The question sounds almost absurd. Everybody knows what money is. We use it every day. We work for it, spend it, save it, worry about it. Yet the more I looked at it, the stranger it became. Imagine being stranded on an island. You have food, fresh water, shelter, and $10 million in cash. How much has your situation improved? Not very much. The money cannot feed you. It cannot build a roof. It cannot heal an injury. It cannot grow crops. It cannot even keep you company. The realization sounds obvious, yet its implications are surprisingly deep. Money itself does nothing. At first, that statement sounds ridiculous. After all, entire governments worry about money. The news talks about money every day. The global economy seems to revolve around it. And yet, look carefully. Money does not bake bread. Bakers bake bread. Money does not heal wounds. Nurses and doctors heal wounds. Money does not produce electricity. Engineers and technicians produce electricity. Money does not grow food. Farmers grow food. Money does not build houses. Builders build houses. In every case, the actual productive force turns out to be people. People cooperating with one another. People applying skills. People creating things. People providing services. People interacting with nature. Suddenly the spotlight moves. Because if money itself does none of these things, then what exactly is its role? That question stayed with me, and the longer I sat with it, the stranger things became. Because another question immediately appeared. If money only works because people collectively believe in it, what exactly does that mean? Think about it. A 50-euro note has very little intrinsic value. Its power comes from something else entirely. People accept it. Businesses accept it. Institutions recognize it. Laws support and enforce it. Society continuously behaves as though it possesses value, and therefore it does. The moment that collective agreement disappears, the note becomes colored paper. Nothing about the paper itself changed. What changed was the agreement, the story, the participation, the collective belief. And once I saw that, another thought appeared, a rather unsettling one. How many things that seem solid and unquestionable derive their power in exactly the same way? That question turned out to be far more important than the original question about money, because suddenly money no longer seemed unique. In fact, it started looking like one example of a much larger phenomenon. Governments, corporations, national borders, property rights, legal systems, national identities. At first glance, these things appear completely different from money, yet they all possess the same strange characteristic. They exist, they matter, they shape lives. People organize their entire existence around them. And yet they only continue existing because enough people continuously believe in and participate in them. I found that realization deeply unsettling because it forces a rather uncomfortable question. If all these things depend upon participation, where exactly does their power come from? We often imagine power as something possessed, something held, something sitting at the top of a hierarchy. But perhaps that picture is incomplete. Perhaps power depends far more on participation than we usually assume. Think about a government. A government may possess tanks, but somebody drives those tanks. A government may possess police, but somebody becomes the police. A government may issue laws, but somebody enforces those laws. The deeper I looked, the more I noticed something fascinating. The structures themselves seemed less important than the countless people continuously bringing them to life. And history repeatedly demonstrates this. Empires collapse. Monarchies collapse. Currencies collapse. Ideologies collapse. Entire worlds collapse. The seemingly immovable mountain suddenly reveals itself to have been held together by something surprisingly fragile, collective belief. And then came what I still think is one of the deepest insights of this entire line of inquiry. Human beings create systems, then forget they created them, then become servants of them. The more I reflected on it, the more universal the pattern seemed. We invent money, then begin serving money. We invent institutions, then begin treating them as though they were features of nature. We invent economic systems, then begin speaking about them as though they were weather patterns. The market demands this. The economy requires that. There is no alternative. Really? Or have we simply forgotten that these systems were created by human beings, created by choices, created by assumptions, created by stories, created by particular ways of seeing the world? And that was the moment another question appeared, perhaps the deepest question of all. If money expresses a particular way of seeing the world, if governments embody particular assumptions, if institutions crystallize particular beliefs, then where do those assumptions come from? What is their source? Because now we are no longer talking about money, or governments, or institutions. We are talking about something deeper, the underlying assumptions from which civilizations emerge, the emotional operating system beneath visible structures, the soil from which institutions grow. That was the point where the entire investigation changed, because the questions themselves changed. Up until then, I had been asking questions about money, questions about systems, questions about institutions. Now I found myself asking something very different. Why does a civilization create money in the first place? Not this particular currency, not this particular economic model, money itself. What problem is it solving? What assumptions make it appear necessary? And the more I thought about it, the more I noticed something curious. Many of the things we take for granted are built upon assumptions about human nature, assumptions so familiar that we rarely notice them. For example, people need incentives. People are fundamentally self-interested. People will not contribute unless rewarded. People will take advantage of one another whenever possible. People cannot be trusted at scale. Again, I am not saying these assumptions are entirely false, nor am I saying they are entirely true. I am merely pointing out that they are assumptions, and civilizations built upon different assumptions may look very different indeed. That realization led me toward what I now suspect may be one of the deepest questions of all. Perhaps the real divide is not between capitalism and socialism. Perhaps it is not between left and right. Perhaps it is not even between different economic systems. Perhaps it runs deeper than that. The more I looked, the more another pattern began revealing itself: fear and trust, not as moral categories, as organizing principles, as foundations upon which entire societies can be built. Think about it. How many institutions arise from the assumption that people cannot be trusted? How many systems are ultimately responses to fear? Fear that there won't be enough. Fear that somebody else will take what is ours. Fear that we will be abandoned. Fear that we are fundamentally alone. Fear that if we stop competing, everything falls apart. Once I started looking through that lens, certain things began appearing in a different light. Hoarding, accumulation, domination, the endless pursuit of security through possession. The voice beneath them often sounds remarkably similar. There won't be enough. Nobody is coming. I must secure myself. I am on my own. And then another possibility began to emerge. Trust. Not blind trust. Not naive trust. Cultivated trust. The kind of trust that develops within healthy relationships. Within healthy communities, the understanding that my well-being depends upon yours, that abundance is collectively produced, that no baker bakes bread alone, no doctor heals alone, no farmer grows food alone, no civilization is built alone. Everything exists within networks of relationship. And the more I reflected on that, the more I began wondering whether many indigenous cultures understood something that industrial civilization has partially forgotten. Not because indigenous people are saints, but many seem to possess a stronger awareness of relationship, of reciprocity, of belonging, of interdependence, a stronger awareness that the individual exists within a larger living whole. A different story. And stories matter, because stories eventually become institutions. Institutions eventually shape behavior. Behavior eventually reinforces the story. A circle, a feedback loop. The seed may already be sprouting. In fact, I eventually realized that the growing criticism of existing systems may itself be evidence of a deeper shift already underway. The questioning is part of the change. The search for alternatives is part of the change. The willingness to challenge assumptions that once seemed self-evident is part of the change. Perhaps the emergence of new possibilities does not wait for some future awakening. Perhaps it is one expression of that awakening. And that was when another idea appeared. An idea that completely changed the tone of this investigation. Artificial intelligence. Most conversations about AI seem trapped in familiar territory. Will it replace jobs? Will it become dangerous? Will it surpass human intelligence? Important questions. But another possibility began to interest me far more. What if AI ultimately serves as something like a nervous system for civilization? The more I reflected on that possibility, the more profound it seemed. Because a nervous system does not rule the body. A nervous system helps the body become aware of itself. It communicates, connects, coordinates, integrates. It allows countless individual cells, organs, and processes to function as something larger than themselves. And suddenly a possibility appeared. What if the most important thing AI ultimately contributes is not productivity, not automation, not convenience, awareness, the possibility of planetary scale awareness, awareness of needs, awareness of resources, awareness of ecological pressures, awareness of opportunities, awareness of patterns that no individual human being could ever perceive alone. Because if there is one thing that has characterized most of human history, it is that we have largely operated without awareness of the whole. We saw our village, rarely the continent. We saw our nation, rarely humanity. We saw our immediate problems, rarely the larger systems from which they emerged. Knowledge remained fragmented. Experiences remained fragmented. Humanity remained fragmented. And perhaps that fragmentation itself has shaped the kinds of institutions we created. After all, if nobody can see the whole picture, coordination becomes difficult. Trust becomes difficult. Long-term thinking becomes difficult. Every group begins acting from its own limited perspective, its own fears, its own interests, its own assumptions. But imagine a civilization capable of perceiving itself more clearly, not perfectly, but more clearly. A civilization capable of seeing where resources exist, where suffering exists, where opportunities exist, where ecosystems are under stress, where cooperation could produce outcomes that no isolated group could achieve alone. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed that humanity might be developing something unprecedented: the capacity for collective self-awareness. And if that is true, the implications are enormous, because a civilization that becomes aware of itself begins asking different questions, questions that would have seemed impossible before. How should we organize ourselves? What are we actually trying to accomplish? What assumptions are we operating from? Which institutions genuinely serve us? Which no longer do? Which stories remain useful? Which stories have outlived their usefulness? And that realization brought me back to where this entire investigation began: money. Because by now the original question had changed completely. I was no longer asking, how should money be distributed? Or which economic system is best? Or even, should money exist at all? The investigation had led somewhere deeper, toward the assumptions from which all systems emerge, toward the stories civilizations tell themselves, toward the realization that institutions are not separate from consciousness. They are consciousness made visible. A monarchy expresses a particular understanding of authority. A caste system expresses a particular understanding of human worth. A prison expresses a particular understanding of justice. Money itself expresses particular assumptions about value, exchange, scarcity, relationship. The institution is not separate from the worldview. The institution is the worldview made visible. And that may be one of the most important realizations of all. Because once a story is recognized as a story, something changes. It loses its status as fate. People often speak about existing systems as though they were eternal, as though they were woven into the fabric of reality itself. But history tells a different story. Empires rise, empires fall, religions evolve, political systems evolve, economic systems evolve. Human beings continuously reinvent the worlds they inhabit, usually unconsciously, occasionally consciously. And perhaps we are entering one of those moments when the process becomes conscious. A moment when increasing numbers of people are beginning to recognize that the systems surrounding them are not immutable facts of nature. They are human creations. Human creations can be examined, questioned, improved, redesigned. And that realization opens an extraordinary possibility. We can begin asking questions that once sounded absurd. How would education work if we started from scratch? How would healthcare work if we started from scratch? How would governance work if we started from scratch? How would resource distribution work if we started from scratch? How would civilization itself work if we started from scratch? Not as fantasy, not as ideology, as design, as experimentation, as a genuine inquiry into what best serves human flourishing. Because perhaps the greatest challenge facing humanity is not technological, nor economic, nor political. Perhaps it is the challenge of becoming conscious participants in the creation of our collective reality, of remembering that the stories we live by are stories, powerful stories, useful stories, necessary stories, but stories nonetheless. And stories can change. That realization does not tell us what the future should look like. It does not hand us a blueprint. It does not answer every question. What it does provide is something far more valuable: freedom. The freedom to imagine, the freedom to question, the freedom to create, the freedom to participate consciously in the ongoing evolution of civilization, the freedom to ask, what kind of world do we actually wish to inhabit? What assumptions do we wish to build it upon? Fear or trust? Competition or relationship? Accumulation or participation? And perhaps the most exciting possibility of all is that this conversation itself is part of that process, part of a civilization gradually becoming aware of itself, part of humanity learning to see its own stories, part of humanity remembering that it is the author. The investigation began with a banknote. It ended with a question. What stories do we wish to live by next?